this idea that the individual should be free to do what he wants unless he's going to hurt others is out the window with everybody in every group today in the time when he's writing this. Now he talks about the ancient communities, and if you are familiar with ancient Greek history, you know that they considered themselves free, but looking back on them, we think of them as very unfree. In fact, their conduct was very tightly and closely supervised by the state. Quote, "The ancient commonwealths thought themselves entitled to practice, and the ancient philosophers countenanced, the regulation of every part of private conduct by public authority." So they thought they were entitled to do this, on the grounds that the state had a deep interest in the whole bodily and mental discipline of every one of its citizens. And then he says this may have been, a reasonable way to think when there was constant warfare and cities attacking cities and stuff. In the modern world, however, the greater size of political communities, and above all the separation of spiritual and temporal authority, I want you to note that that's key. So in the modern world, our political communities are much larger than just city-states, and spiritual and temporal powers have been separated. So in the modern world, this has prevented so great an interference by law in the details of private life. Now, the greater size of our political community isn't the question there, is it? Because Rome had a massive political community, much larger than most states today. And that didn't prevent a big interference by law in the details of private people. So it must be the spiritual and temporal authority, the separation of spiritual and temporal authority. That's the difference between the extremely close supervision of the state, of the details of people's individual lives in the ancient world, and the hands-off view of people's individual lives in the modern world, is the separation between church and state. That's an important point, again, which he just states. He just states it. The tendency of all the changes taking place in the world is to strengthen society and diminish the power of the individual. Now that was, so he sees the growth of collectivism, basically. That was certainly a true observation at the time, an accurate observation. He says the power of the individual is diminishing, and this encroachment is not one of the evils which tend spontaneously to disappear. So this doesn't tend to just go away, but on the contrary to grow more and more formidable. In fact, he says that people are so desirous to impose their own opinions and inclinations as a rule of conduct on others that it is hardly ever kept under restraint by anything but want of power. In other words, people would enforce their views on others if they only had power. So he says here the only thing that stops dictatorship, full-blown totalitarian dictatorship, is just that the people aren't given the power. They don't have the power. So just change that one factor, allow people to have power, and you'll have dictators. Very accurate prediction. It came true. We continued down that path of saying, let's give power back to the people and the people's representative, the dictator, and it became exactly as he would predict here. Now he says in a roundabout way inside of a sentence that we don't need to get the whole sentence, but he says, liberty of thought is impossible to separate from the liberty of speaking and writing. So if you have the freedom to think, then that means you have the freedom to speak and to write. You can't separate them. You can't say you'll go to prison for saying certain things and writing certain things, but you can think them. No, you can't separate those. So if you're free to think, then you're free to speak and you're free to write. Freedom of speech in the press is integral with the freedom to think. So says he, and it's true. Now that's the end of chapter 1, the introductory chapter. On to chapter 2. Quote, this is the title of the chapter is Of the Liberty of Thought and Discussion. Quote, "The time, it is to be hoped, is gone by when any defense would be necessary of the liberty of the press." He says he hopes that we don't have to defend the press anymore. So the time has gone by when we have to defend freedom of press as one of the securities against corrupt or tyrannical government. We all know that it secures us against corrupt or tyrannical governments, he says. Now, the problem with things that everybody knows is that at about every 20 to 30 years, all of those people pass into senility and a new group of people take over, or 40 years or something like that. So the problem with things that everyone knows is that pretty soon, if you don't teach them to the younger people, nobody knows them because the older people die off. Humans don't last all that long. He continues his positive thinking here. "No argument can now be needed against permitting a legislature or an executive to prescribe opinions to the people and determine what doctrines or what arguments they shall be allowed to hear." We don't even need to argue about that anymore. We all know that no legislature or executive should be able to prescribe opinions to the people. He says we all know that. That's obvious. Now, if he could have seen what was coming just in the dictatorships of World War I and World War II, that's enough. That and Soviet Russia, that would be enough to prove him completely wrong, that his hopefulness was completely wrong. But additionally, you could show him Britain and Canada and the Scandinavian countries and France circa 2010, post 9/11, 2005 would do. Just show him there that there is a legislature or an executive which prescribes opinions to the people and determines what doctrines or arguments they should be allowed to hear. Like Ann Coulter was not allowed to speak in Canada because they determined it was hate speech, what she was going to say. The Ayn Rand Institute tried to ship some pamphlets to a university in Canada, and they were apprehended at the border, confiscated at the border, for being hate speech. Ezra Levant and Mark Stein were both taken to court for human rights violations because of things they said in Canada. And I'm sure you know all the other stories that have been going around about this stuff. So he was really, really wrong that everybody knows and understands these things. We don't have to talk about freedom of speech and stuff anymore. Everybody knows that. Wrong. Liberty requires eternal vigilance. Those who will not defend their freedoms by force will not have freedom. That's what I just said. Now, he poses a hypothetical for us on the next page. He says, let's suppose that the government is entirely at one with the people and never thinks of exerting any power of coercion unless in agreement with what it conceives to be their voice. So it only coerces the people when it believes the people want it. Quote, "But I deny the right of the people to exercise such coercion, either by themselves or by their government." So he says it doesn't matter if you get your whole society together and the government is just carrying out society's wishes, still you cannot violate people's rights. You cannot coerce. You cannot initiate the use of physical force, in Ayn Rand's phrase. He says, the power itself is illegitimate. It doesn't matter who says you can use it or why. It's illegitimate. The best government has no more title to it than the worst. Doesn't matter how good your government is. It cannot carry out violations of rights or forceful coercive acts. Now, he makes an assertion which some people will simply disagree with. If all mankind minus one person were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing him than he would be in silencing them if he had the power. Now, some people would say, actually the majority should rule, but he's saying the majority can only rule in things where you don't have to coerce the person, where there's no violence or initiation of force involved. So the majority, as far as that's concerned, doesn't matter, it's out the window. Majority rule means nothing. The individual